on Twitter when they started the Twitter Spaces thing and just having conversations about democracy because we were just getting into the pandemic then. And, we were all just, kind of losing our minds and found community. And it was just so nice to be able to connect, with people in that way. And then immediately a light bulb went on and, I thought, well, some real work can be done here. And so
Yeah.
Advocacy Arena was born, and it's all about getting people civically engaged. And so the group that we have here today are they're informed folks, and always eager to learn and very civically engaged. And
Yeah.
I did when I first started my Substack, one of the first articles I did about civic engagement, of course, references your work. I have three works that I recommend people to just kind of get an understanding of what's going on and where we are, a lay of the land. I recommended three books. The first one, Ruth Ben Gott, of course, Strongman. Yours, Shadow Network, and Cass by Isabel Wilkerson.
Mm,
Like,
yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, I won't keep you too long here, and we'll just start to dive in. And I wanted to start with the first question is for you to kind of explain the structure of the Shadow Network, some of who the key players are, how it's centralized and how it operates, because I think I've watched millions of interviews of you talking about it. Like I said, I'm a real fangirl.
Oh,
And
thank
I
you.
love the book so much. I bought it twice. I have the hardback. I have a paperback and I have it on audio because I'm just
Oh,
always, like I said, going back to it because you do such a beautiful job of just kind of explaining the structure of the Council for National Policy and how they operate in our politics today in our democracy. So if you could just kind of give folks a little background on that.
yeah. And before, I'll just say I feel that we women have a special role to play. For whatever reason, I think a lot of women have a stronger compassion muscle than some another unnamed sex that I
Yeah, I
and I think a
agree.
lot of what's going on is that there are people who are looking at society as what can I get out of it, and other people who say, well, the common good is good for me, right? And it shocks me how big the gulf is between those two people. And one of my problems as a writer is I always try to get inside the head of the people I'm writing about, and I look at Elon Musk and there's no way in. It's like, what is he thinking? You know?
Yeah, you don't want to go in there.
Well, it's my job.
Uh,
And I will say that I'm so appreciative of people who read my book and take it seriously because I really wrote it as what I hoped would be a service, that people could use it. And it just pleases me when that happens. And I'd like to mention another book I wrote, which is called Suzanne's Children, which
I
is a
just saw that on your website. I'm going to have to get that one.
well, and I read the audiobook of that one. And it takes place in occupied Paris, which was a very different circumstance, but it's a woman who was a mother and a wife and decided to devote herself to helping other people's children. And it's a book that matters a lot to me, and it's not the same topic, except it is, right?
Yes.
No. Um, and and I also found her so inspiring that I think about her every day when I get up and when I get tired, you know, at which I bet we all do. So in terms
Yeah.
of Shadow Network, pardon?
I just said, yeah, I can understand that. Yeah.
So I now when I wrote Shadow Network, it really began its life in 2016 on election night. When my beautiful feisty daughter and I were watching the returns with a bottle of champagne ready,
I know.
a split.
Yes, I had worked the polls that day, so I was exhausted. And then, yeah.
Yeah, and we were just watching the New York Times election meter go from 99% to zero and saying, what just happened? And so when I wrote this book and published it in 2019, there was a lot of doubt about what I was reporting. And I'm like, well, there are 1,000 footnotes. If you want to doubt it, go back to
I
the
know.
sources. This is not a conspiracy theory because it's not a theory. And actually, there is a conspiracy, but there it is. And I feel that as the field has gotten much more crowded and the premise has been more accepted, there are two things that I feel I bring to it that not everyone does. And one is my origins in Nebraska and Oklahoma. So these are the worlds I grew up with. And I've got a comparison between the times that I lived there in the 60s and 70s and what's going on now. And I will say both Nebraska and Oklahoma were purple states with really outstanding Democratic lawmakers, as well as Republican lawmakers. And they actually got along well enough.
They
They
were
did
real lawmakers. They like public servants, you know.
they figured things out and they didn't spend all of their time hating on each other. So I had to say, okay, what happened? Because there are people, in my circles in New York City who say, oh, anybody who doesn't live on the East Coast is stupid and, backward. And it's like, no, something happened and it was engineered. And I think the other thing that I bring to it is growing up in and continuing to be in a Protestant tradition and being very interested in the dynamics of Protestantism in this country and the way that bad actors have exploited and abused American Protestants, also other religions, Catholics, etc. But the Protestants have really been weaponized more than anyone else in this process. So I'll try to give a capsule version of the thesis of the book, and then I'd really love to go on to more specific questions.
Okay.
The story begins with the civil rights movement, and when the federal government decided that segregationist institutions, including schools, should not get tax benefits, right? Tax exempt status. And there were white supremacist religious leaders, including powerful, wealthy ones who were televangelists like Jerry Falwell and Bob Jones, et cetera, who said, well, this is unsatisfactory. We need to build a political movement where we get to have our say. And our segregationist schools and colleges will have all of the benefits of all of the other ones. So they secretly set about pushing back on civil rights legislation. They set up an organization called the Council for National Policy in 1981 that brought in people from the fossil fuels industry who bankrolled it. And they set about creating a kind of parallel movement that was intended to take over the Republican Party and create a backlash to all of the social progress that had been that had been brought about from 1900 to the present. And that wasn't just civil rights for racial minorities. It was also women's rights. It was also social security. It was everything that would cost billionaires any tax income to help anybody else. So they didn't want to pay taxes and they didn't want to use any money to help anyone else. They didn't want environmental protections because that cut into their profits, even if it meant poisoning entire communities. But they needed a political machine to do it. And they were not going to be able to campaign on this platform. It's like, yeah, vote for me, I'll poison your children, right? So what they had to do was find ways to identify blocks of voters in strategic areas that did not require a national majority, right? Because of our strange electoral system with the Electoral College and the Senate and disproportionate representation. But if you're very strategic and you slice and dice it the right way, you can win a minority rule. And that is what they've done. Now, they are also counting on the fact that something like 30 to 40% of Americans don't vote, right? Don't vote at all. So when people say Trump won the majority in the last election, he won a very, very slight majority of the votes that were cast, including with a lot of hook and by crook from people like Elon Musk and other individuals who entered in and interfered. But again, he did, he didn't, he won something like, in the 30 percentile of the eligible voters. So what we have here is a situation that they are able to exploit because of two reasons. One is that a lot of these low propensity voters, the people who just could vote but don't, live in news deserts. So they don't get any accurate professional journalism that reports facts. And Ralph Reed, one of the leaders of this movement, said, oh, there are 18 million evangelical voters who don't vote. And if we go after them and persuade them to vote for us, we can swing these critical elections. And they did. They started out really operating through the Southern Baptist Convention, which already had a history of difficult and unacceptable racial positions. I mean, they were founded in order to support slavery in the 19th century. So that's their history.
As Martin Luther King said, the most segregated hour in America.
Yeah, but they really broke away from the American Baptist Church in the 1840s or 50s in order to defend slavery. So this was a very particular instance, and they built on that. And again, growing up in Oklahoma, being adjacent to Texas, there were, they were purple states, Missouri, et cetera. And you didn't know that a Southern Baptist was going to vote, who they're going to vote for based on their religion or anyone else. But they targeted these people, and they kept trying, they had very sophisticated techniques of focus groups and messaging, et cetera. And they kept tweaking and tweaking until they found code words that hit a nerve. And it became unfashionable at that time to be openly racist, so they went for abortion. But they went for abortion under false pretenses. They invented the term partial birth abortion. And they went into these churches, these evangelical churches, with videos of animations of forceps that reached into the mother's womb to a healthy, fully formed fetus and tore the arms off. And they said, this is what the Democrats do. And of course, there was no one there to actually correct them. And people in the congregation would sit there and say, oh, that's terrible. And then the pastor would get up and say, it's a sin to vote for a Democrat. And you get enough of these people mobilized and you live with the results. So over time, since 1981, when the Council for National Policy was founded, they have built out their information systems. They've got radio, like Salem Radio. They've got television, like the Christian Broadcasting Network. And now they have a zillion digital platforms and flood the digital feeds of these people with things that are just patently untrue. And whereas back in the day, when every little town in Oklahoma had its own newspaper that ran Associated Press stories on the front page, so you had some kind of corrective, and then the radio stations would take their news from that paper, they have open season in these places. And they also attack education, both public schools and higher education. They vilify public school teachers who have dedicated their lives to working with children. And I've attended some of their events reporting and have heard them say, oh, what happens in public schools is that a school nurse will take a child into her office at lunch hour and perform a sex change operation on them. And they'll go home, they'll come to school a boy and go home a girl. Now, I've been a parent, and you had to write like 3 permission slips to have your kid get an aspirin.
Yes.
So, but I think you have people who have this hunger for drama, and they have and the emotions that are aroused by these horrific tales. They're working a lot with Pentecostal audiences now, and so they're merging politics into Revelations and Leviathan and and of course Kamala Harris is Jezebel. They go after that one. So they're really playing on these people. And I'll just finish this statement by saying that until now, a lot of their lies have been very hard to counter, because it's hard to prove a negative. It's like, no,
Right.
Democrats don't do that. They don't believe that. That's not what they do. But you can't, it's hard to prove what people don't do. But right now, in this particular year, it is an incredible moment of truth, both for the United States and the world, because their their movement is fragmenting. I follow this as closely as I can,
Mhm.
uh, and Trump is failing physically and mentally, and the policies are starting to hit people in their daily lives. So if you say to them, no, Ukraine doesn't persecute Christians, they're like, where's Ukraine? Right? If you say, let's support democracy, that's like, I can't eat democracy. When you say, wow, I just went to the grocery store and they want $12 for a chicken. Okay. That's where they live. And one thing that we will anticipate is that next month, people's health insurance bills are going to, as they say, fall off the cliff. That is going to have a huge impact on people's lives and their access to medical care and the ability of our doctors and nurses to even continue to do their work, especially in the rural communities, which often don't have high incomes. So it breaks my heart, but there are going to be a lot of people who suffer, and some of them are dying. And
Ab-
that will get some attention. And what is needed, from people like us, is to go into these communities and help explain to people why and how this is happening. And we don't have the old newspapers. We don't have the old media systems that they do. What we have is ourselves and the
Right.
ability to
Us.
look people in the eye and to gather people together and say, it doesn't have to be this way, right? We are capable of caring for each other. And billionaires need to pay their taxes the same way we do. And when they do that, we create a society that benefits all of us and spares the most vulnerable of us from suffering. So that's where I am right now.
Exactly. Well, you hit on so many things, and like I said, because in a couple of things that you said, because me growing up in the South and in a religious community, I was baptized at 12 years old into the Pentecostal faith. So
Uh-huh.
I understand how it works, And
You
my
know from
father,
Leviathan.
exactly. And my father is a Baptist preacher.
Uh-huh.
So I'm steeped in kind of this religious, community and understanding. And I know like how they are able to um brainwash people with this because truly the our faith for me it's like the core of our being. It is the lens in which we see everything, and so they have taken advantage of that and twisted it in such a sick way, and that's again why it angers me so. It's because I am a person of faith, and to see what they're doing to people who just want to be good human beings, and how they fall for it. And so I really can relate to that aspect. But what angers me is, and what I feel like your book really, helps to highlight is how, as you said, if the rich people paid their taxes, you know, how much better things would be. But the rich people are the ones who are kind of, funding this and orchestrating that. So if you could talk a little bit about these donors and how they do that infrastructure, it is so huge, and it's how things, kind of move fast and big, I think, in that infrastructure that they've built.
Yeah, absolutely. So the donors that I write about who are connected to the Council for National Policy not only included the fossil fuel interests from Oklahoma and Texas and Louisiana, uh, but I mean they're continue to be very important. Let's be, and I've written a whole bunch of follow-up articles for the Washington Spectator about all of this. So Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, comes from Louisiana, straight out of this donor network and straight out of these religious facilitators. So the way to think about it is that the big donors who are billionaires assign these multi-million dollar budgets to organizations like the Family Research Council, the National Rifle Association, the Susan B. Anthony group that's anti-abortion, and then they go to these rather unsuspecting Christian communities and try to find whatever's going to motivate them, not just to vote their way, but to mobilize their friends, to download their apps, to do canvassing. And I did one piece that I would love you guys to take a look at. That's free. It's Washington Spectator online, no paywall, about a Pentecostal political rally in Michigan before the last election, where they put up these QR codes. And Turning Point USA Faith runs this operation where they said they wanted to enlist 500 churches in Michigan alone, and they would have weekly education gatherings where they would provide the materials. Oh, our fire alarm is it's a battery problem. Just a second.
Okay. Are you guys enjoying this? I am just really thrilled to have her here and sharing all the stuff that we have had so many conversations about. And I hope that, you guys are learning some new things and just as excited as I am. So I appreciate you guys.
Sorry about that. My husband
No
is testing
worries.
it.
Yeah, no worries.
He's in charge. So anyway, in this piece, I mean, when you have to appreciate that I spent 3 consecutive days in the tent with this meeting.
My God.
The heavy metal Christian rock was pretty bad. Uh,
Yeah, they're bringing all the things in now to get people, into this movement.
well, not only that, but almost into like this frenetic phase, right?
Yes.
It's a big psyops.
Hmm.
And then they put up the QR codes and they say, not only do you then go and canvass all of your evangelical neighbors that show up on your app and tell them to vote Republican, but you also sign up to be a vote counter. And they openly said, if you're a vote counter, you can be a spy in the camp, quote unquote, right? So the piece is called God and QR codes. And
I remember that piece because we talked about Turning Point USA Faith. And I explained to people that like that was a spinoff from Turning Point USA to specifically target churches. Like that was their goal to go in and literally politicize churches. And my co-host in Good Trouble Chat every week I have on Monday is from Michigan. So Gwen, she's in here, so I know she can appreciate that. So I'm so glad that you tell that story. And if you have a link, Carrie, thank you, Carrie. Just shared the link in the chat, guys, and we'll talk about that. But continue, go ahead.
well, and they said they had 3,000 people in the tent, and it went over 3 days. And again, the last November, I mean, the election differential in Michigan was razor thin. So if you think that those 3,000 people went out and each one talked to 3 people, right? That goes a long way in winning an election. So they're very
Absolutely.
sophisticated. And when they use their digital technology, they use something called geofencing, which means that they set up devices around a perimeter and then they harvest the data from people's cell phones and not only give them messaging telling them what to do, but in some cases they very sneakily get permission to download their contacts and send messages that appear to be from them, right? So this is a massive operation.
It really is. It's scary how, yes. how
Yeah.
much it
Yeah.
covers.
So they've been doing it in a number of different churches. There was an there was an operation in Wisconsin with a related group called Catholic Vote that did it there as well. So they're really, really targeting churches. And, this geofencing is used in a lot of different places in American society. We don't really have good regulation of it yet. But when it's used for political operatives with churches where people are going to get only one political message, it raises very serious questions. So they're involved in all kinds of things, and they're very closely linked and collaborate with people in the Trump campaign. Brad Parscale is one of the people who's been a link in the data operations. Um, right now, we're at a very interesting pivotal point. I don't know if people have been looking at the America Fest from Turning Point USA over the last few days, but you've got a big, big battle going on over MAGA influencers over Israel.
Mm.
And some of the Christian Zionists are saying, no matter what Israel does, we support them. Some of the younger elements are saying the United States should not be supporting Israel for various reasons. Some of them don't want any foreign aid to anybody. Some of them are worried about Gaza. Some of them are anti Semitic. It's a real mishmash of motivations, but it's causing serious problems there. And it's causing serious problems at the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank that oversees a lot of operations of this movement. And we're also responsible for overseeing Project 2025, which is basically the architecture of what they're carrying out now. So, as this very day unfolds, you have this exodus from the Heritage Foundation to Mike Pence's new think tank. And you have entire departments leaving to go to Pence's operation. So, a lot of times people ask me, what's going to happen? And I say, I don't have a crystal ball. Today I do. I think you're going to see a revival of Mike Pence as a public figure and possibly as a candidate. And I also see signs that Ted Cruz is reactivating his. Now I've seen both of them in person speaking, and I will say that in terms of charisma, they're very challenged. So
Yes.
I don't I will be very interested to see a race that in primaries that could involve Trump, Vance, Cruz, and Pence. And in fact, I'd rather like to see that. But there's a lot going on with them right now, and if the Democrats could overcome some of their dysfunction, they would have a very interesting opportunity moving into the midterms.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you shared that because I wasn't aware. I knew that there was an exodus happening in the Heritage Foundation, but I didn't realize that they were actually going to Mike Pence. I didn't realize that he had created a think tank. So I'm going to have to come up to speed on that
Well, and the
because,
interesting thing is that Pence's thing, now Pence was the favorite for the Council for National Policy before 2016. He and Cruz and Rubio were their guys.
right.
And now it appears, from what I saw just today, that Pence's think tank is getting funding from prominent figures in the CNP. So good.
They keep their money in and like they got behind, Trump because I mean he won the votes or whatever, but their guy was Cruz actually because he was, very much, kind of a part of their efforts and everything. And it's going to be interesting to watch that. I'm going to be looking for more reporting from you on that and following some of that as well. So um,
Well, I will say, as a special treat, that I'm just closing an investigative piece that should be out like very soon, like in the next day or two, that is about the government of Israel's multi-million dollar effort to geofence megachurches in 4 southwestern states and to pay pastors and Christian social media influencers to uh, basically promote Israel and portray all of Palestine as extremist.
Wow, that's interesting because we also talked a lot about when the massacre happened in Israel, how they basically use that to create this psyop. Like there is righteous, indignation about what is, being done there. But it's also been co-opted and being used. And I find it very interesting that now a lot of the litmus test is around this Gaza issue, And so I definitely will be looking for your reporting on that because it's hard to get people, I think, sometimes, even those on the left, to really understand, how this is being used and how it's, really subverting, real conversations around this. So, um,
Well, and it requires a level of nuance that we are very it's very hard to achieve. So, for example, a lot of the people on both sides are quoting Charlie Kirk, who's now being portrayed by the movement as a Christian martyr.
yes.
Um, but they're all pulling videos of him where he's critical of Israel and he's critical of Christian Zionists, uh, unqualified support for Israel. And then people who are avowed anti-Semites can take that and use it. So it's a real mess. And the reason for the exodus at the Heritage Foundation is because the head of the Heritage Foundation, Roberts, refused to condemn Tucker Carlson for platforming Nick Fuentes, who is an open anti-Semitic. But at the same time, Tucker Carlson is in a hot seat because at the same time that he's criticizing Israel as a Christian, he's also working with the government in Qatar, one of the Arab Gulf states, and has bought a house there.
Oh my
So
goodness.
I always tell people to follow the money because if you say, what is so and so's motivation? It's, in this crowd, it's very rarely the Sermon on the Mount.
Exactly. And that is the thing. The money is what's guiding so much of this. And so we, have to look at, who those donors are and what their motivation is and how they're guiding this. And there was a question in the chat. I'll come back to that, guys. I saw it. I didn't miss it. Really interesting. But I wanted to ask you about well, you kind of covered that, the influence that they have because it's kind of reforming, I guess you could say, the structure that they're using.
But
Um,
I'd also like to recommend, since you guys are obviously whizzes at research, I'm really impressed with like your comments. Um, Look at the American Values Coalition. It is a group that I have been supportive of since its beginning, and it is an organization that looks to support evangelical pastors, many of whom are socially conservative, but they're anti-MAGA. And one thing that I've learned from them is that the pressure they're subjected to is extreme. So these are pastors, some of them from small churches, a lot of them don't make a lot of money. And on the one hand, the MAGA forces come and offer them big payouts, they offer them expense paid junkets. This project I just mentioned just flew over 1,000 pastors to Israel for an expense paid trip. And they say they're going to fly over 10,000 next year. Okay. All expense paid. And they get all kinds of support. They get sermons written for them. They get materials to distribute. And if you're an American Values Coalition pastor, most of their position is, I'm doing this to preach the gospel. That's my job. I'm not, I praise Jesus, not Trump. That's what I signed up for. They get hate messages on their machines. They get harassed. They have the, attacks trying to pull their congregations and split them up and to desert their churches. There's even a website that Council for National Policy organizations have created called Find a Church, where people are supposed to grade their pastors on how passionate their MAGA message is from the pulpit. And their slogan is, if your pastor doesn't get an A, find a new pastor or find a new church. So it's, I really admire the work of the American Values Coalition in trying to equip these pastors to pull their congregations away from QAnon and these other forces. But it's an uphill battle because they are operating with a tiny fraction of the budget of these other people.
Absolutely, because I read a lot about when Kirk created that Turning Point USA Faith, like that was all part of their agenda. Like they were determined to get rid of pastors who were not willing to go the distance and to politicize and to push these messages. So it's interesting that you talk about the grading system and things that they have created. It's just like a cult that just keeps growing and growing and growing, and they just keep putting this food in that helps it to become more ingrained in them. Looking at the time here, and I'm just so thrilled, and I think everyone else is. I want to leave a little bit of time for some questions, but I'm going to be looking for your piece and sharing it. I know we'll talk about it because I think that this is such an important thing for people to understand, because it's just not politics as usual. Like we have these other forces working that I don't think that a lot of people understand, because as you said, our media, that we grew up with no longer exists. So people have to find these resources to get informed, and people like you to follow who are reporting and doing deep dives. But we have every other week, every 2 weeks, I have discussions. And
Yeah.
the focus of that is to dig down into, because the issue is for me, like all of this boils down to white supremacy, like that is, and white Christian nationalism. That's kind of what we're facing, and how, it is, being carried out from different places makes, a difference. And I think sometimes people really don't understand, but it all boils back down to that. And when you started, you talked about how these churches formed because they were against the civil rights movements, and the games, and the Brown v. Board, and how that activated a lot of their activities, especially in churches, and it's just kind of grown, continued to grow, and I think it's having a definite revival right now. And
Well, and
um,
one of the things that really offends me is the way that they've co-opted a number of African American pastors. And one of the pieces that I did for the Washington Spectator um, includes, it's about the school board takeover and
mm,
the way it was used to help win the Virginia governorship for Glenn Youngkin. And in the middle of it, Ken Blackwell, who is one of their prominent African American members, says, "Oh yeah, we figured out the black churches in the black areas of Virginia, and went into the churches and told them that vaccinations for COVID were a plot to kill black people, and that the Democrats were trying to exterminate black people with COVID vaccinations." And then we bought up all the ads on the African American radio stations, and boy, they were really cheap. And we bumped up those votes for the Republicans by 5-10%. And it just made me sick, because that black people died from not getting those vaccinations.
absolutely. And some of that messaging stuck,
Yeah.
and it really makes me sick, because my mom was a nurse. I'm a veteran, and my service in the military was in a combat support hospital. And
Oh
then
wow.
afterwards, I worked for orthopedic surgeons. So, it made me sick to see how they are trying to kill people. Like, it's interesting that, Mitch McConnell used to always, when they were, trying to pass the ACA, kept accusing Barack Obama of, creating death panels. I said, now we have real death panels with
That's
these
right.
guys. They're trying to kill us, you
And
know.
it's very interesting because when we saw the casualties from COVID, they were over, predominantly with older people, people with underlying conditions, poor people, right? Low income populations, and very disproportionately African American. But now, with the campaign against vaccinations that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is launching, you're getting all of the low information citizens uh, cottoning onto this. And you've got in Oklahoma and other southern states epidemics of measles and whooping cough. You've already had deaths from them, from people who say, oh, vaccinations are dangerous. And so anyway, my when I get overwhelmed, I say all roads lead to the midterm.
Yes, yes. It's really our kind of, I feel like, our last opportunity to keep this ship from, like, just going over the cliff, and I told you I want to kind of transition a little bit to
Can I just
your
make
book.
one little comment? They're
Yes,
noting that the
please.
webpage for American Values Coalition has expired, and I think it's just a glitch because it was up fairly recently. That happens sometimes. So they do have a podcast. They do have other things online, and feel free to be back in touch with me, and I'll check out what happened with their webpage.
Okay, absolutely. And I do love that there is, like this organization of true Christians and pastors who are trying to push back against this bad faith,
Well,
and
and I mean, I struggle because I don't know that I or anyone can say what is a true Christian and what isn't. And it's been interesting for me to have communion with these people where there are a lot of things we disagree on, right? Um, but I think that what we're losing is the ability to have a dialogue and negotiate a satisfactory outcome for everyone.
yes.
So I, what, for example, I'm pro-choice. Um, and in the conversation with them, sometimes I find that they say, well, I'm against abortion for a healthy fetus in the third trimester. It's like, yeah, me too. Yeah, we agree. And I say, I think that a woman, who is not able to sustain a pregnancy in the first trimester should have the right to terminate. And they're like, yeah. So rather than this binary pro or anti or let's hate on each other, what you're really talking about is a couple of weeks in the second trimester, right?
Right.
And it's a delicate matter. And I have a friend who's a high risk OBGYN, and she says that's when the most severe birth defects can be detected, in the second trimester. Okay, so let them guide us through medical knowledge, not a bunch of yahoos sitting in the Republican legislature of Ohio who, wouldn't know a trimester from a tricycle.
Exactly. And that is something else, like the ripple effect, the catastrophic fallout from, the ideology that they push, the strain that they put on healthcare providers, like
Absolutely.
the doctors, I feel the talent drain that is resulting from this, like, doctors and OBGYNs, they don't want to come to a state like Tennessee that has no exceptions, you know. And
Oh, they're fleeing the red states because
mhm.
they, I mean, and this friend I'm talking about, and several other practitioners I've spoken to in my trip around the country with bad faith have said they want me to kill my patients.
Yeah.
And this includes ectopic pregnancies that will never result in a child, never, ever. But you have to let it kill the mother in order to avoid providing. I mean, that's criminal. That's evil. But again, the Yahoo in the legislature doesn't know or doesn't care, one of the two. So
Right. And
I just, we all roads lead to the midterms.
absolutely. And one of the things that I have been really pushing in regards to that midterm and helping citizens to understand their power, a lot of the takeaway I take from kind of two things. I in discussions we kind of do documentary watch it and discussions, and of course we did Bad Faith, but we also did the American Coup, the 1898 Wilmington coup. And then, I've talked about your book, Red Orchestra, that, I read, and that was hard reading, but good. But those two things, help me to understand in situations that actually happened where people came together, like they maybe didn't, see eye to eye on everything, but when it came to their democracy and freedom, they came together because, in the 1898, it was, the Fusion Party, like some of these, white poor people, realized they needed political power, and, the Black people were newly voting, freed. They pulled their resources and they worked together so that they could both gain power, for the greater good of the community. And then in Red Orchestra, one of my takeaways is, the two parties, the, communist and the democratic socialists, coming together to fight the Nazis, but, they realized it a little too late, they,
Well, yeah, and that was after they facilitated the rise of the Nazis by trying to undermine each other, and it was more the communists undermining the social democrats. I mean, and they have to bear that historical legacy.
exactly. And I see a little bit of that kind of stuff happening here within our part, like the progressives or the far left and the centrists or whatever. And I just want to keep saying, come on, guys, come on. Like let's sort all of this, this 10 or 20% of differences out later. Let's just work together on this 80-90% that we agree on to save our democracy so we have a chance to sort it out.
One of
Um,
the hardest parts of the Bad Faith tour for me um, was in these stops, like at North Carolina and Omaha, where people, well-meaning people, said, "I can't vote for the Democrats because of Gaza."
yes,
And I said, "You think the Republicans will be better?" And it like, "Well, we're voting for Jill Stein." And, it's not my style to get into, an argument, but it just made me sad because the third and fourth party candidates in the swing states definitely had an impact in that election. And it was just such a misguided idea. And I'm not saying the Democrats, you know, I'm not endorsing their policy on Israel, but I don't think that what we've gotten is an improvement.
exactly,
She,
exactly.
she tries to say diplomatically.
I think you did a terrific job. Oh my goodness. Well, again, like I said, we're kind of getting down here to the last 10 minutes of the hour, and I didn't want to keep you too long, but I wanted to give some folks here in the audience an opportunity, perhaps, if you guys could raise your hand if you have questions for Anne, and then I want her, because she kind of understands our mission, what we're doing here. If she could leave us with some closing thoughts and words around how we just kind of stay motivated and keep doing that. So can we do that? Is everybody okay with that? All right.